Good evening, this is Keith All, and in today's tutorial we're going to be learning how we can create box shadows using CSS and HTML. Now this is going to be part one of multiple parts. So this is what we'll be learning how to do on the left hand side. So we can see we have multiple different types of box shadows along here. And let me scroll down and you'll see the other ones here. So this is what we're going to be learning in this series. Now for this first part we're going to learn how to do this shadow and how we could do this shadow right here. So let's see what the index HTML file looks like. It's basic. It's got a one main div, which is a container that holds all these individual divs that you see here, which are basically these boxes. So, and then within that one main container, I'm going to have multiple divs, and I just name them appropriate 1 through 7. We're going to have two classes for each div. One of them is called box, the other one is type 1. And then it moves up from there all the way through type 7. So let's go over to the style CSS and let's see how this looks like. So basically the asterisk here is what we're going to be using as the default for the entire web page. So I'm just setting the margin and padding to 0. The body tag here is going to be basically we're going to center the divs within the body, and we're going to give it a background color. So this background color is what you see here. It's a blue type color. Again, the justify content and align items. Basically, justify content centers it. It's going to center it horizontally, and align items will center it vertically. And I'm going to be using a display type of flex. Now what does this mean? The display property specifies the display behavior. In other words, the type of rendering box for a particular element. So this element in this case is a body tag. And so you know later on display flex by default it's gonna display its items or stack them from left to right. So in other words, when we what I mean by items are basically you have an item here, container, and within the container you have multiple items, or children is what they're referred to also. So you may be wondering, well, by default they will be stacked left to right. Well, what I do to change that behavior, to stack it from top to bottom like this, I come over to the container div that we're going to be styling here. Also, we're going to be using a display property and setting it to flex. The flex direction is column. So in other words, when you use the property for flex direction, you could set it to multiple different values. And it sets the direction of the children or items inside of this container or this div. So if I remove this, and you can see what will happen. Let's remove it for a second. Okay, I'm going to save that. Now let's refresh the browser. And as you can see, by default, the items will stack from left to right, as you can see what they're doing here. But I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to undo what I just did. Save it. Let's refresh. And let's bring it back to so it's easier to see. So there's margin between each one. So let's go back over here. And now let's look at the box class. The box class is basically I'm setting each div here that you see 1 through 7. I'm going to set the width to 300 pixels, so that's the width of this. and the height is set at 200 pixels. And the margin in between each item or each div is I'm setting a top and bottom margin, which is the distance between here, to be 40 pixels. And then and the second value of the margin property is set to 0. So I'm not setting any value for the right or left margins on each one of these boxes or divs. The background color, I'm just setting the background color of these divs to be white. And the font size, I'm just using a 3EM, so that's the size of this text that you see here. And again, I'm setting the display property to flex. Again, here we have the justify content and align items. Again, both of those will center it both horizontally and vertically within this div. So let's now look at the type 1 class. So the type 1 here. So what we're looking at right here is this shadow that you see here. Okay, so let's see how we're doing this. We're using a box shadow property, and it has multiple values. The first value, which is minus 30 pixels, refers to the horizontal offset. So basically, if I use a positive value here, the shadow will be on the right side of this div. But in this case, since I'm using a negative value, the shadow will appear on the left side of the div, as you can see here. The vertical offset, again, I'm using a positive value here. So the positive value, if I'm setting it to be 30 pixels, then I'm going to be setting the bottom in this case. If I use the negative, it would show up on the top. So I could go ahead and put a negative value. Let's refresh it and you'll see what happens. See, now it puts the shadow on top. So let's just bring this back to the bottom. Refresh the screen, and there we go. Now this third value is referring to the blur radius. So you can see the radius of this shadow is slightly blurred, and it's going to be blurred by 20 pixels. The third or the fourth value is the spread, and it's optional. I'm just setting the size of the shadow to be 10 pixels. So if I set this to be, let's say 30, I'm increasing the shadow size, and you'll see in a second. I'll refresh the screen. See, it increases the size of the shadow. So that's what the spread does. Okay, the fifth value is I'm setting the color of it. So RGBA, basically if it's all zeros for the first three parameters, or values or attributes, however you want to refer to it, it's going to be black, and that's what it is. And the fourth value of this, I'm setting the opacity of it. So if I increase the 1, you'll see it become darker. See how dark it gets? So I'm setting it back to 0.5. Refresh the screen, and there you have it. So that's how we build this type of shadow. Now let's look at how we build this type of shadow, which only appears on the right side, and then of course it appears behind the div too. So what we're doing here is we're using a before studio class for the box class, the subclass of type 2, and we're setting up before studio class. And what this basically does, on this we could add another element, even though it appears that we only have one element for this particular div. So what we're doing is we're adding another element, and I'm going to show you in a second. I'm going to set the Z index to 1, and it's going to bring this shadow forward. Watch what happens. Okay, now it appears on top of this div. So in other words, I'm using this before studio class to build another element, which is this. And so basically how we build this, it's going to start building it, start from the bottom of the type 2 div and move up 5 pixels. The left is 10 pixels, so it's going from the left going over 10%. The width of it is going to be set to 90%, so the width of this element is now 90% of what this entire width of this div is. And the height is 50 pixels, so set the height, which is the height of this element. And then let's see, the background, again, first value, 3 values are 0, so it's going to be black, and I'm setting the opacity to 5, so it has a shade to it, but it's not completely dark. And let's see, the transform origin is basically, let's start painting this from the left side. And then the skew Y, or the transform property, I'm using the skew Y function, and it's going to be skewed by 5 degrees. So what does that mean? It's going to skew this, instead of being completely horizontal, it's going to be skewed downwards. Now watch what happens when I remove that, and watch what happens to this element. See, it completely makes it perpendicular to this div instead of, well, actually parallel. What am I saying? This is parallel now. So if I skew it downwards, it's the y-axis, and I'm going to skew it down by 5 degrees. Let's save this first. There we go. So that's why it only appears on the right side here, and it appears that there's only a shadow right here. But since I have the z index to 1, it's going to appear on top of it. So let's put the z index back to -1. That means this div, this white box, will show up on top. This will appear behind it. There you go. And now you only see that portion. And of course, the filter blur of it is, watch what happens if I don't have this filter blur. See how sharp it is right now? So I'll put the blur back in, and it just blurs this element by 5 pixels. Okay, so that's the end of this part 1. So this is how you could create different types of box shadows within CSS and HTML. Now look for my next video, which I'll explain to you how we build then these 2 shadows and this type of shadow. Okay, so I want to thank you for stopping by today. Please stop by often. I upload multiple videos a week. And please subscribe to my channel, and also click on that bell notification so you always get updated when I have a new video ready. And also please like, share, and comment. I'd certainly appreciate it. And of course, I appreciate your time here today. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye now.